There's nothing that cuts deeper than losing a child, and nothing lonelier than having nowhere to turn when grief swallows you whole. On a cold Montana night, 18-year-old Mattie Jo Keller stands at the door of wealthy rancher Elias Grant, her baby having died in her arms just hours before. She whispers the words that will change both their lives. "I lost my son today. Can I stay in your cabin for one night?" The gruff cattle baron, a man hardened by his own losses, does something that surprises them both. He opens his door and his heart. What starts as one night of shelter becomes something deeper as two broken souls discover that sometimes healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from sharing the weight of it. But when the town starts talking and old wounds are reopened, will their fragile bond survive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Mattie Jo Keller finally found the courage to knock on Elias Grant's door. She stood there in the Montana darkness, her bare feet bloody from walking 12 miles through mud and stone, clutching a threadbare baby blanket against her chest, like it might somehow bring back the tiny soul who had drawn his last breath in her arms that morning. Elias Grant was not a man who welcomed visitors. At 58, he had spent the better part of 2 decades perfecting the art of being left alone. His log cabin sat at the edge of his vast cattle ranch like a fortress, surrounded by miles of rolling grassland and protected by his reputation as the wealthiest and most antisocial man in Wilder Creek. The townspeople called him fair but cold, generous with his money but stingy with his words. What they didn't know was that Elias had learned long ago that silence was safer than conversation, and solitude was preferable to the kind of pain that came from caring too much about people who could be taken away without warning. The knock came soft at first, barely audible above the drum of rain on his tin roof. Elias looked up from his supper, a simple meal of beans and cornbread that he ate at the same rough-hewn table every night at precisely 6 o'clock. He waited, hoping whoever it was would realize their mistake and leave. But the knock came again, more urgent this time, followed by a voice so broken it might have been carried on the wind. "Please," the voice said, "I know it's late, but I need help." Elias set down his spoon and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to peer into the storm. What he saw made him step back, as if he'd been struck. A young woman, barely more than a girl, stood swaying on his porch. Her dark hair was plastered to her skull, and her simple cotton dress, probably her best dress, he realized was soaked through and torn at the hem. But it was her face that stopped him cold. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror 23 years ago, the morning after they'd lowered his 6-year-old daughter into the ground. When Elias opened the door, Mattie Jo looked up at him with eyes so empty of hope they seemed like holes burned through parchment. She was shivering violently, though whether from cold or shock, he couldn't tell. "I lost my son today," she whispered, her voice catching on each word like it was cutting her throat to say them. "Can I stay in your cabin for one night?" Elias Grant was not a man given to impulse. Every decision in his life had been measured, calculated, weighed against potential consequences. He'd built his fortune on careful planning and his emotional walls on the same principle. But something in this girl's voice reached past all his defenses and grabbed hold of something he thought had died with his daughter. "You can stay as long as you need," he heard himself say, and the words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. He stepped aside, and she stumbled into his warm, dry cabin like a ghost finding shelter from a storm. She stood dripping on his wooden floor, still clutching that blanket, and he could see now that it was handmade, probably stitched with love for a baby who would never grow old enough to remember the woman who made it. "Sit by the fire," Elias said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I'll get you some dry clothes." He disappeared into his bedroom and returned with a flannel shirt and a pair of his late wife's trousers that he'd never been able to bring himself to give away. When he handed them to Mattie Jo, their fingers brushed for just a moment, and he felt how cold she was. Cold all the way through, like winter had settled in her bones. "There's a room behind the kitchen," he said, pointing toward a door he hadn't opened in years. "You can change in there." While she was gone, Elias stoked the fire and put on a pot of coffee, moving with the mechanical precision of a man who had learned to function despite carrying a weight that threatened to crush him every morning when he woke up. He'd been thinking about his daughter Sarah more often lately, wondering what she would have looked like at 29, whether she would have married, whether he might have been a grandfather by now. The wondering was its own kind of torture, but tonight, with this broken girl in his house, the memories felt different. Not gentle, exactly, but not quite as sharp. When Matty Joe emerged from the back room, swimming in his clothes, she looked even younger than her 18 years. She sat in the chair he indicated, close to the fire, and accepted the cup of coffee he offered, with hands that shook so badly he had to steady it for her. "What was his name?" Elias asked, settling into his own chair across from her. It was a simple question, but he knew it was the right one. When you lost someone, their name became both the most precious and the most painful thing you possessed. "Samuel," she said, and for the first time since she'd arrived, something like warmth flickered in her eyes. "Samuel James Keller. He lived for 6 months and 3 days. He had blue eyes like his daddy, but he smiled like me. At least, that's what folks said. Tell me about him." For the next hour, Matty Joe talked about her son, how he'd laughed at dust motes dancing in sunbeams, how he'd gripped her finger with surprising strength, how he'd gotten sick so suddenly that by the time she'd walked to town for the doctor, it was already too late. She spoke with the careful precision of someone handling broken glass, each memory both precious and painful. Elias listened without interrupting, understanding instinctively that this was what she needed, not advice or comfort, but simply someone to witness her grief. He knew from experience that sometimes the most important thing you could do for another person was to let them say their loved one's name out loud. When she finally fell silent, exhausted by the effort of remembering, Elias spoke quietly into the crackling warmth of the fire. "I lost my daughter 23 years ago," he said. "Sarah, she was 6. Fever took her in 2 days, just like that. Her mother died birthing her, so it was just me and Sarah for those 6 years. When she died, I thought I was going to follow her right into the ground." Matty Joe looked at him with something approaching surprise, as if she hadn't expected this weathered, silent man to understand exactly what she was feeling. "How do you bear it?" she asked. "How do you wake up every morning knowing they're not coming back?" "Some days you don't," Elias said honestly. "Some days you just survive until the sun goes down and you can sleep again. But eventually you find reasons to keep going. Work, duty, sometimes just stubbornness." "I don't have any of those things," Matty Joe said. "My husband died last winter. I don't have family. I don't have money or land or anything that matters." "You have Samuel's memory," Elias said. "That matters." She looked down at the blanket in her lap, running her fingers over the careful stitches. "I made this for him before he was born. I thought it would keep him warm and safe. Foolish thinking." "Not foolish," Elias said firmly. "Loving. There's a difference." Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the cabin walls, but inside, the silence between them was companionable rather than empty. Elias found himself studying this young woman who had appeared at his door like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. She was clearly poor. Her shoes had been little more than scraps of leather held together with string, and her dress, though clean, had been mended many times. But there was something in the way she held herself, even in her grief, that spoke of dignity and strength. "Where will you go tomorrow?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "I was hoping to find work in town, maybe cleaning houses or taking in washing. I can work hard." "Town's not kind to young women with no family," Elias said, remembering the gossip and judgment that followed anyone who didn't fit neatly into Wilder Creek's narrow ideas of respectability, especially ones with stories that don't add up neat and tidy. "I don't have anywhere else to go." The simple truth of that statement hung between them like smoke from the fire. Elias Grant was a man who had spent 23 years protecting himself from exactly this kind of complication. He'd learned to live with his grief by keeping it contained, controlled, predictable. Letting someone else into his carefully ordered life was the last thing he should do. But as he watched Mattie Jo Keller hold her dead baby's blanket and try not to cry, Elias realized that maybe protecting himself wasn't the most important thing anymore. Maybe some kinds of pain were meant to be shared. In the hidden drawer of his bedroom bureau lay a tarnished military medal decoration for valor earned in a war that had taught him the difference between surviving and living. He'd survived Sarah's death, survived his wife's death, survived 23 years of quiet loneliness. But survival wasn't living, and living required taking risks. "You can stay here," he said suddenly. "Not just tonight, as long as you need." Mattie Jo looked at him with something between hope and disbelief. "I couldn't. I don't want to be a burden." "You wouldn't be," Elias said, and he was surprised to realize he meant it. "This place is too big for one person anyway, and I could use help with the cooking and cleaning. I'm not much good at either. I don't have money to pay you room and board." "I don't need money," Elias said. "I need—" He stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. What did he need? Companionship? Purpose? Forgiveness for the 23 years he'd spent hiding from life? "You need what?" Mattie Jo asked gently. "I need to remember what it feels like to take care of someone again," he said finally. "It's been a long time since I had a reason to be anything other than just another old man counting days until his time runs out." She studied his face in the firelight, and he could see her weighing his offer against her pride, her desperation against her dignity. "If I stay," she said finally, "it won't be charity. I'll earn my keep. I'll cook and clean and mend and whatever else needs doing. I won't be beholden to anyone, not anymore." "Fair enough," Elias said. "We'll call it a business arrangement." But even as he said it, both of them knew it was already something more than that. It was two people who had lost everything, deciding to pool their broken pieces and see if they could build something whole. Mattie Jo didn't sleep that first night. She lay in the narrow bed in the room behind the kitchen, staring at the ceiling beams and listening to the rain finally ease to a gentle patter against the window. The flannel sheets smelled of lavender and age, and she wondered who had slept in this bed before her, whose hands had smoothed these blankets. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Samuel's face in those final moments peaceful, almost like he was simply drifting off to sleep. The fever had broken just before dawn, and for one terrible, hopeful moment, she'd thought he might recover. Then his breathing had simply stopped, quiet as a sigh, and she'd known her world had ended. She'd held him for hours after, unwilling to accept that something so small and perfect could simply cease to exist. It wasn't until Mrs. Brennan from the neighboring cabin had come looking for eggs and found them that reality had finally crashed down. The older woman had been kind but practical, helping her prepare Samuel's tiny body and arrange for burial in the churchyard, where Mattie Jo's parents already rested. "You can't stay here alone, child," Mrs. Brennan had said. "This cabin belongs to the bank now, with your husband gone. They'll be coming for it soon enough." That's when Mattie Jo had remembered the stories she'd heard about Elias Granther, wealthy rancher who lived alone in the big cabin at the edge of town. People said he was strange but not cruel, generous with his money but careful with his trust. Desperate people did desperate things, and walking 12 miles in the rain to beg shelter from a stranger had seemed like her only choice. Now, lying in his guest room with Samuel's blanket pressed against her chest, she tried to make sense of the kindness she'd found. Elias Grant wasn't the cold, distant man the townspeople described. There was sadness in him, yes, deeper than any she'd ever seen, but there was also something else, careful gentleness that spoke of someone who understood exactly what it felt like to lose everything. When dawn finally crept through the small window, Mattie Jo rose and dressed quietly. She'd slept in the flannel shirt he'd given her, and it hung nearly to her knees like a nightgown. She found her own dress hanging by the fire, dry now but wrinkled and stained. She put it on anyway, folded the borrowed clothes neatly, and made her way to the kitchen. Elias was already awake, standing at the window with a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the sunrise paint the grassland gold. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and she was struck again by how the morning light softened the hard lines of his face. "You didn't sleep," he said. "It wasn't a question." "No," she admitted. "I kept thinking I heard him crying." Elias nodded as if this made perfect sense. "That goes on for a while, the hearing things that aren't there, your mind trying to make sense of a world that doesn't include them anymore." "How long?" she asked. "Different for everyone. For me, it was about a year before I stopped setting two places at the table." Matty Joe looked at the small wooden table where he'd been eating alone the night before, trying to imagine it set for a father and daughter sharing their morning meal. The picture made her chest ache with fresh grief, not just for Samuel, but for all the breakfasts they would never share, all the conversations that would never happen. "I should make myself useful," she said, looking around the kitchen. "I promised I'd earn my keep." "There's no hurry," Elias said. "Take time to grieve properly." "I can grieve and work at the same time," Matty Joe said with more firmness than she felt. "Keeping busy helps. At least, I hope it does." Elias studied her for a moment, then nodded toward a collection of pots and pans hanging from hooks on the wall. "I haven't had a proper cooked breakfast in more years than I care to count. If you're determined to work, I won't argue." As Matty Joe moved around the kitchen, familiarizing herself with where things were kept, she discovered that Elias Grant might be wealthy, but he lived simply. The cabin was well built and comfortable, but not fancy. The furniture was sturdy and practical, the decorations few. It felt like a place where someone lived, rather than a place where someone showed off. She found eggs in a basket by the door, bacon wrapped in brown paper in the cold cellar, and flour in a tin canister. As she worked, mixing batter for biscuits and frying bacon in a cast-iron skillet, she was aware of Elias watching her with quiet attention. "You cook like someone who's done it all her life," he observed. "My mama taught me when I was little," Matty Joe said, cutting biscuits with the rim of a glass. "Said a woman who could feed her family well would never want for anything important." "Your mama sounds like a wise woman." She was. Matty Joe slid the biscuits into the oven and turned to face him. "She died when I was 14. Papa followed her 6 months later. That's when I married Tommy, me husband. I needed someone to take care of me, and he needed someone to keep house. You were awfully young to be on your own." "Young people grow up fast when they have to," Matty Joe said, then immediately regretted the bitter edge in her voice. This man had shown her nothing but kindness. He didn't deserve her anger at circumstances he hadn't created. But Elias didn't seem offended. "What was your husband like?" he asked. Matty Joe was quiet for a long moment, focusing on turning the bacon so it wouldn't burn. Tommy Keller had been many things handsome, charming when he wanted to be, quick with his fists when he didn't get his way. But speaking ill of the dead felt wrong, especially to someone who had given her shelter. "He was troubled," she said finally. "The war changed a lot of men, made them harder than they started out. Tommy had a difficult time finding his place when he came home." It was a generous way to describe a man who had spent more time in saloons than at home, who had used his fists to settle arguments and his charm to avoid consequences. Tommy had never hit her where it would show, but he'd made sure she understood who was in charge of their small cabin and their smaller life. "War does change men," Elias agreed quietly. "Some of us spend years trying to find our way back to who we used to be." There was something in his voice that made Matty Joe look at him more closely. "You were a soldier?" "Officer, 23rd Infantry. I enlisted young, like most fools do, thinking war was about glory and honor." He was quiet for a moment. "I learned different." "Is that where you got the scar?" she asked, nodding toward the thin white line that ran from his left temple to his jaw. "Shrapnel," he said simply. "Gettysburg. I was lucky most of the men in my unit weren't." The bacon was done, and Matty Joe lifted it onto a plate, using the grease to make gravy. As she stirred, she thought about how many stories of loss and survival were walking around in the bodies of people who looked ordinary from the outside. Elias Grant carried the war in that scar, just like she would carry Samuel in the ache that had settled permanently in her chest. "Can I ask you something?" she said as she pulled the biscuits from the oven. Of course. Why did you let me stay? Really, I mean. You don't know anything about me except that I showed up at your door in the rain. Elias was quiet while she set the table, placing hot biscuits and bacon and gravy between them like an offering. When they were both seated, he finally answered. I've been alone in this cabin for 23 years, he said. I told myself it was what I wanted, what I needed. But last night, listening to you talk about your son, I realized I'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed by another person. I'd forgotten that grief shared is grief halved. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something small, a wooden cross, roughly carved and worn smooth with handling. I found this in your dress pocket when I hung it up to dry. I hope you don't mind that I saw it. Mattie Jo's breath caught. She'd forgotten about the cross, though she'd carried it every day since her mother's death. Mama made it for me when Papa got sick. She said if I ever felt lost or alone, I should hold it and remember that somebody always loved me, even if they weren't there to show it anymore. Your mother was right, Elias said, handing the cross back to her. Love doesn't die just because the person who gave it to you does. It just changes shape. Their fingers touched as she took the cross, and for a moment, the grief that had been crushing her since Samuel's death felt lighter. Shared between two people who understood that love and loss were two sides of the same precious coin. Outside, the morning sun was burning away the last of the clouds, promising a clear day. Inside the cabin, two broken people sat sharing breakfast and beginning to discover that sometimes healing came not from forgetting the past, but from finding someone brave enough to remember it with you. 3 days later, while cleaning the kitchen cupboards, Mattie Jo discovered a small wooden box tucked behind the flour and sugar canisters. The box was beautifully crafted, with delicate hinges and a tiny brass latch that opened with a soft click. Inside, she found dozens of recipe cards written in a careful feminine hand. Elias, she called, holding the box carefully as she walked into the main room where he sat reading a week-old newspaper. I found this while cleaning. I didn't want to go through it without asking. He looked up from his paper, and she saw recognition flicker across his face, followed by something that might have been pain or might have been tenderness with Elias. The two emotions often looked remarkably similar. That was my wife's, he said quietly. Rebecca. She died giving birth to Sarah, but she was a fine cook. Always said a recipe was a love letter to the people you fed. Mattie Jo opened the box again and pulled out a card at random. Written in faded blue ink were instructions for molasses cookies, with a note at the bottom, Sarah's favorite ad, extra ginger for Christmas. Would it be all right if I used some of these? She asked. I've been making the same 5 meals over and over. Your wife clearly knew her way around a kitchen better than I do. Elias was quiet for so long that Mattie Jo began to worry she'd overstepped. The recipe box was obviously precious to him, a connection to the wife and daughter he'd lost. She was about to apologize and put it back when he spoke. Rebecca would have liked that, he said. She always said food was meant to be shared, recipes were meant to be used. What good was a love letter if nobody ever read it? That afternoon, Mattie Jo made Rebecca Grant's beef stew with dumplings, following the careful instructions and trying to imagine the woman who had written them. The recipe called for a bay leaf from the garden, and when Mattie Jo went outside to look for the herb patch, she found it overgrown but still producing rosemary and thyme and sage growing wild among the weeds. As she worked in the kitchen, measuring and stirring and tasting, she felt a strange sense of connection to this woman she'd never met. Rebecca Grant had stood in this same spot, using these same pots, probably worrying about whether the stew would turn out right, whether her husband would like it, whether her daughter would eat her vegetables. When Elias came in for supper and smelled the familiar aromas, he stopped in the doorway like he'd seen a ghost. I haven't smelled that in 30 years, he said, his voice rough. Is it all right? Mattie Jo asked, suddenly worried that she'd caused him pain by bringing back memories that were better left buried. It's more than all right, he said, settling into his chair at the table. It's like having her back in the house for a little while. As they ate, Elias told her stories about Rebecca, how she'd insisted on cooking elaborate meals for just the two of them, how she'd sung while she worked. How she'd planned to teach Sarah all her recipes when the girl was old enough to reach the stove safely. She would have been a wonderful mother, he said, cutting a dumpling with the side of his fork. She had so many plans, so many dreams about the family we were going to have. Tell me about Sarah, Matty Joe said gently. Elias's face softened in a way she'd never seen before. She was bright as a penny and twice as mischievous, always getting into things she shouldn't, asking questions about everything. She had Rebecca's laugh and my stubborn streak, which was a dangerous combination. What did she like to do? She loved the horses, used to follow me around the barn, trying to help with the chores. I taught her to ride when she was 4. Rebecca thought she was too young, but Sarah was fearless. She could have been a fine horsewoman if she'd lived long enough. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of shared memories settling around them like a familiar blanket. Outside, they could hear the lowing of cattle in the distance and the whisper of wind through the grass. Inside, the cabin felt warmer somehow, more alive than it had since Matty Joe's arrival. I should probably go into town tomorrow, Elias said as Matty Joe cleared the dishes. Pick up supplies, check on the bank business. Would you like to come along? Matty Joe's hands stilled on the plates. She hadn't been around other people since Samuel's funeral, hadn't faced the questions and sympathy and judgment that would inevitably come from the townspeople who knew her story. I don't know, she said honestly. People will talk. People always talk, Elias said. The question is whether you care what they say. I care about you, she said, looking at him directly. Your reputation, I mean. Having me here eat's not conventional. I don't want to cause you trouble. Elias stood and walked to the window, looking out at his land as the sun began to set behind the mountains. When he spoke, his voice was firm but not unkind. I'm 58 years old, Matty Joe. I've got more money than I know what to do with, and no family left to inherit it. My reputation has survived worse things than giving shelter to a young woman who needed help. If the good people of Wilder Creek want to gossip about my business, that's their choice. But it won't change what I do in my own house. What if they think? What if they assume? What if they do? He interrupted, turning back to face her. What anybody thinks about the arrangement between you and me is none of their concern. We know what this is, and that's what matters. Matty Joe nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. She'd seen how quickly a woman's reputation could be destroyed by whispers and speculation, how the assumption of impropriety could ruin a life even when there was no truth to it. But Elias was right about one thing: she couldn't hide in his cabin forever. Eventually, she would have to face the world again. All right, she said. I'll come with you, but I'd like to stop by the churchyard first, if that's acceptable. I haven't been back since the funeral. Of course, Elias said. We'll make that our first stop. That night, as Matty Joe lay in her narrow bed with Samuel's blanket pressed against her cheek, she thought about Rebecca Grant's recipes and the woman who had written them with such care. There was something comforting about following in the footsteps of another woman who had loved and lost, who had found joy in the simple act of nourishing the people she cared about. Tomorrow she would visit Samuel's grave and try to explain to him why she wasn't dying of grief the way she'd expected to. Tomorrow she would face the townspeople and their questions and their judgment. But tonight she was safe in Elias Grant's cabin, surrounded by the lingering aromas of a meal that had brought the past and present together in ways that felt like healing. In the kitchen, Rebecca's recipe box sat on the counter, waiting for the next day's meal, the next small act of love expressed through flour and salt and careful attention. Some kinds of love, Matty Joe was learning, were strong enough to survive death and generous enough to extend to strangers who needed them most. The broken fence post stood at the corner of the north pasture like a crooked tooth, its top splintered where lightning had struck it during the spring storms. Elias had been meaning to replace it for weeks, but somehow there was always something more pressing that needed attention. Now, with Matty Joe beside him carrying a toolbox and a new post, he wondered if he'd been putting off the job because it felt too much like starting over something he'd grown uncomfortable with over the years. This whole section needs work, he said, running his hand along the weathered rails that connected the damaged post to its neighbors. Should have done it months ago, but I kept telling myself it would hold through another season. Sometimes things last longer than you think they will, Matty Joe said, setting down the toolbox and examining the fence with a practical eye. And sometimes they need tending before they fall apart completely. She was talking about the fence, but Elias suspected she meant more than that. Over the past week, he'd watched her move through his cabin with quiet efficiency, mending small tears in curtains, oiling hinges that had started to squeak, replacing the wick in a lamp he'd been meaning to fix. She worked with the focused attention of someone who understood that small problems left unattended became big problems eventually. "You know anything about fence work?" he asked, pulling on his leather gloves. "Some," she said. "Tommy wasn't much for maintenance, but our neighbor Mr. Patterson used to let me help when he worked on his property, said I had good hands for detail work." They worked together in the morning sunshine, digging out the rotted base of the old post and setting the new one in place. The work was satisfying in the way that physical labor could be straightforward and honest, with progress you could see and measure. As they stretched new wire and secured the rails, they fell into an easy rhythm of conversation. "Tell me about your childhood," Elias said as he held a rail steady while she hammered in a nail. "Before your parents died, before you married, what did you want to be when you grew up?" Matty Joe paused in her hammering, a slight smile crossing her face. "That's a question nobody's asked me in years," she said. "I wanted to be a teacher. I loved books, loved learning. I used to imagine having my own schoolhouse, with rows of children all eager to discover something new." "What stopped you?" "Life," she said simply. "When Mama and Papa died, I didn't have money for more schooling. Marriage seemed like the only practical choice. And then Samuel came along, and I thought maybe being a mother was better than being a teacher anyway, at least until—" She stopped, the hammer stilling in her hand. "You could still teach," Elias said gently. "There's always a need for good teachers, especially out here where schools are few and far between. I don't have the education for it. 3 years of formal schooling doesn't qualify a person to shape young minds. Education isn't just about certificates and formal training," Elias said. "It's about curiosity and patience and the ability to help someone see something they couldn't see before. From what I've observed, you have all of those qualities." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the steady rhythm of hammer on nail creating a percussion that mixed with the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and wind moving through the grass. There was something healing about this kind of work, Elias realized, the sort of task that required just enough attention to keep your mind occupied, but not so much that you couldn't think about other things. "Can I ask you something?" Matty Joe said as they moved to the next section of fence. "Of course. What did you want to be when you were young, before the war, before you became a rancher?" Elias was quiet for so long that she began to think he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old dreams carefully folded away. "I wanted to be a doctor," he said. "My father thought it was foolish, said doctoring was for city folks, that ranch life was good enough for any man with sense. But I was fascinated by how the body worked, how it healed itself, when given the chance." "What changed your mind?" "The war changed it for me," he said. "I saw too much death, too much suffering that couldn't be fixed, no matter how much you knew about anatomy or medicine. When I came home, the idea of trying to heal people seemed like arrogance. How could I promise to cure someone's fever when I couldn't even cure my own nightmares?" "But you did heal," Matty Joe said, looking at him with gentle eyes. "Maybe not completely, but enough to keep going, enough to build a life." "Building a life and living it are two different things," Elias said. "I've been good at the first, not so good at the second." As they worked, sharing stories and comfortable silences, Elias found himself watching Matty Joe with growing admiration. She approached every task with careful attention, whether she was measuring fence rails or stirring gravy or listening to his rambling memories. There was a quality about her that reminded him of still water calm on the surface, but with depths that went further than you might expect. When they stopped for lunch, eating sandwiches in the shade of an old cottonwood tree, Matty Joe surprised him with a question that cut straight to the heart of something he'd been trying not to think about. "Do you ever regret letting me stay?" she asked. "No," he said without hesitation. "Do you regret coming here?" "No," she said, then added more slowly, "But I worry sometimes that I'm taking advantage of your kindness, that I'm using your guilt about your daughter to avoid facing my own responsibilities." Elias set down his sandwich and looked at her directly. "What responsibilities? You're 18 years old, Matty Joe. You've buried your parents, your husband, and your son. You've got no family, no money, and no prospects except what you can make for yourself. If accepting help when you need it is taking advantage, then every person who's ever leaned on a friend or neighbor in hard times is guilty of the same thing. It's different when you're a woman," she said. "People expect you to figure it out on your own or find a man to take care of you. They don't expect you to just stay, to make yourself at home in someone else's life." "Then people's expectations are foolish," Elias said firmly. "You're not a burden, Matty Joe. You're not charity. You're someone who needed help, and someone who gives help in return. That's what decent people do for each other." They finished their lunch and returned to work, but the conversation had shifted something between thema recognition that what they were building was more than just a fence. They were constructing a partnership based on mutual respect and shared understanding, something that could withstand the winds of gossip and judgment that were sure to come. As the afternoon wore on, they made good progress on the fence line. The new posts stood straight and strong, connected by rails that would hold against whatever weather the seasons might bring. When they finally packed up their tools and headed back to the cabin, both of them were tired but satisfied with their work. "Good fence should last 20 years if it's built right," Elias said, looking back at their handiwork. "And if it's tended properly," Matty Joe added. "And if it's tended properly," he agreed. They walked back to the cabin together, tools between them and the satisfaction of shared labor binding them in ways that words alone could never accomplish. Behind them, the fence stood ready to weather whatever storms might come, just like the unlikely partnership that had built it. The music box sat on the highest shelf in Elias's bedroom, hidden behind a stack of ledgers and covered with years of dust. Matty Joe discovered it by accident while cleaning, her cloth catching on its corner as she wiped down the shelf. When she lifted it to dust underneath, the lid popped open, and a delicate melody filled the room, a lullaby she recognized from her own childhood. The tune was Brahms' Lullaby, played by a tiny ballerina who spun slowly in the center of the box while the music played. The ballerina wore a pink tutu and had golden hair painted in careful detail, her arms raised in a graceful pose that spoke of dreams and innocence. Matty Joe stood transfixed, watching the little figure turn, while the sweet, melancholy notes filled the air around her. She didn't hear Elias come up the stairs, didn't know he was standing in the doorway until the music wound down and stopped. When she turned, she saw him frozen there, his face gone pale as winter sky. "Sarah's," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd forgotten it was still up there." "I'm so sorry," Matty Joe said quickly, moving to close the lid. "I was just cleaning, and it opened by itself. I didn't mean to." "No," Elias said, stepping into the room. "It's all right. I just haven't heard that song in 23 years. He walked slowly to where she stood, his eyes fixed on the music box as if it might disappear if he looked away. When he reached her side, he gently took the box from her hands and wound the key again. The ballerina began her slow dance, and the lullaby started over, each note clear and pure in the afternoon quiet. "Rebecca bought this for Sarah when she was 3, he said, his voice thick with memory. "Sarah used to wind it up every night before bed and dance along with the ballerina. She said she was going to be a dancer when she grew up, or maybe a princess, or maybe both at the same time." Matty Joe watched his face as he spoke, seeing 23 years of buried grief rise to the surface like water from a deep well. His hand shook slightly as he held the music box, and she could see him struggling between the desire to remember and the need to protect himself from the pain that memory brought. "She sounds wonderful," Matty Joe said softly. "She was," Elias said. "She was everything good in the world, everything bright and hopeful. When she died, It felt like all the light went out with her. The music began to slow as the spring wound down, the ballerina's turns becoming more deliberate, more labored. When it finally stopped, the silence in the room felt heavy with unspoken sorrow. "I should have brought this out years ago," Elias said, still staring at the music box. "Rebecca always said grief shared was grief halved, but I was too proud to let anyone see how broken I was. Too afraid that if I started crying, I might never stop." "There's no shame in crying," Matty Joe said gently. "Sometimes it's the only honest thing we can do." As if her words had given him permission, Elias's composure finally cracked. The tears came slowly at first. Then, with increasing force, 23 years of carefully controlled sorrow breaking free all at once. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the music box cradled in his hands, and wept for the daughter he'd lost and the father he'd never been able to be. Matty Joe sat beside him without a word, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She knew there was nothing she could say that would ease this kind of pain, knew that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for another person was simply to witness their grief without trying to fix it or hurry it along. "I used to dream about her," Elias said when the tears finally subsided. "Every night for years, I'd dream she was still alive, still 3 years old, and dancing to this music box. I'd wake up expecting to hear her voice calling for me, and the silence was like dying all over again." "Do you still dream about her?" "Not as much," he admitted. "I told myself that was healing, but now I think maybe it was just forgetting. Maybe I was so afraid of the pain that I started letting go of the joy, too." Matty Joe understood exactly what he meant. Since Samuel's death, she'd found herself avoiding anything that reminded her of him, his clothes, his toys, even the songs she used to sing to him. She'd thought she was protecting herself, but maybe she was just cheating herself out of the good memories, along with the painful ones. "I sing Samuel's lullabies when I'm working alone," she said quietly. "It hurts, but it also feels like keeping him alive somehow. Like as long as I remember the sound of his laugh or the way he smelled after his bath, he's still real, still part of the world." Elias looked at her with something approaching wonder. "How did you get so wise at 18? "I'm not wise," Matty Joe said. "I'm just tired of being afraid of my own memories." They sat together in the afternoon light, the music box silent between them, but somehow still present, still important. Outside, they could hear the everyday sounds of ranch life cattle moving in the distance, wind rattling the barn doors, the creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. Inside, two people who had spent years running from their grief were finally learning to sit still with it. "Would you like me to put this somewhere you can see it?" Matty Joe asked eventually. "The music box, I mean. It shouldn't be hidden away like something shameful." Elias considered this, his fingers tracing the painted details on the ballerina's tutu. "The mantelpiece," he said finally. "Sarah always said that was the most important place in any house, where you put the things that mattered most." They went downstairs together, and Matty Joe carefully placed the music box on the mantelpiece in the main room, positioning it so the ballerina faced outward, ready to dance for anyone who might want to see her. When she wound the key and the lullaby began to play, the entire cabin seemed to brighten somehow, as if a window that had been shuttered for 23 years had finally been opened to let in the light. "She would have liked you," Elias said, watching the ballerina spin. "Sarah, I mean. She was always bringing home stray singered birds, orphaned kittens, children from town who needed a friend. She had a gift for seeing the good in things that other people might overlook." "I would have liked her too," Matty Joe said, and she meant it. There was something about the idea of Sarah Grantbright and mischievous and full of dreams that made her feel connected to a past she'd never lived and a future she was only beginning to imagine. As the music box wound down and the ballerina's dance came to an end, Matty Joe realized that something fundamental had shifted between her and Elias. They were no longer just two broken people sharing space and silence. They were beginning to become something newer, family built not on blood or law, but on the mutual decision to stop running from love simply because love sometimes led to loss. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting golden squares on the wooden floor where the music box cast its small shadow. In that light, with that music still echoing in the air around them, healing felt not just possible, but inevitable. The land deed lay spread across Elias's desk, like a map to a buried treasure, its edges yellowed with age, and its formal language dense with legal terminology that made Matty Joe's head spin. She'd found it while organizing his business papers, filed between cattle purchase receipts and bank statements, in a folder labeled Property Holdings 1,000, 847 1,872. Elias, she said, carrying the document into the kitchen, where he sat reading the weekly newspaper. I found this while sorting your papers. I think there might be a mistake. He looked up from an article about railway expansion and took the deed from her hands, his expression growing thoughtful as he scanned the familiar document. No mistake, he said quietly. I bought this land 15 years ago, when the original owners died in the influenza outbreak. The Keller homestead 40 acres along Willow Creek, with a cabin and barn. Matty Joe felt the blood drain from her face. Keller homestead, that was my family's land, where I grew up with Mama and Papa. I know, Elias said gently, setting the deed on the table between them. I recognized your name the first night you were here, but I wasn't sure if you'd made the connection. You own my family's land? The words came out barely above a whisper. All this time, you've owned the place where I was born? Elias nodded, his face grave with the weight of this revelation. When your parents died, the land went up for auction to pay their debts. I bought it because it bordered my property and because— He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Because I couldn't bear the thought of strangers living where a family had been so happy. Matty Joe sank into the chair across from him, her mind reeling with the implications. The little cabin where she'd learned to read by lamplight, where her mother had taught her to bake bread and tend the garden, where her father had carved wooden toys and told stories by the fire, all of it belonged to Elias Grant. Had belonged to him for 15 years, while she'd married Tommy Keller and moved to his ramshackle cabin on the other side of town. Why didn't you tell me, she asked. At first, I wasn't certain you were the same Keller family. Then, when I realized you were, I didn't know how to bring it up without seeming like I had ulterior motives for helping you. What did you do with it? The cabin, the land? Nothing, Elias said. I left everything exactly as it was. I go by sometimes to check on the buildings, make sure they're weatherproof, but otherwise it just sits there. I told myself I might use it for seasonal workers someday, but the truth is, I couldn't bring myself to change anything. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Matty Joe tried to process what this meant, that the home of her childhood had been preserved like a shrine, waiting all these years, while she'd struggled through marriage and motherhood and loss just a few miles away. Can we go there? She asked suddenly. I'd like to see it again. Of course, Elias said. Whenever you're ready. They rode out that afternoon, taking the wagon along the dirt road that wound through Elias's pastureland toward the creek. Matty Joe had made this journey countless times as a child, but never as a passenger, never from this direction. Seeing her family's land from Elias's perspective made it look different, somehow smaller than she remembered, but also more precious, like a jewel set carefully in the vast Montana landscape. The cabin came into view as they crested a small hill, and Matty Joe's breath caught in her throat. It looked exactly as she remembered, weathered but solid, with morning glories still climbing the porch posts and her mother's apple tree heavy with fruit in the yard. Elias had clearly kept his word about maintaining the buildings. The roof was sound, the windows intact, the garden gate still hanging straight on its hinges. Papa built that fence when I was 10, she said, pointing to the neat rail fence that surrounded the vegetable garden. He said a garden without a fence was just a buffet for the rabbits. They walked through the empty rooms together, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. The furniture was gone, sold at auction. Matty Joe assumed, but the rooms still held the shape of the life that had once filled them. She could see where her parents' bed had stood, where the kitchen table had hosted countless family meals, where she'd sat by the window, reading on winter afternoons. In her old bedroom, she found something that made her gasp with surprise. Her name, carved carefully into the windowsill in her father's precise lettering. Matty Joe Kellerone, 1855, marked the year they'd moved to this cabin when she was 8 years old. He did that the first week we lived here, she told Elias, running her fingers over the carved letters. Said it was important for a person to mark their place in the world, so they'd always know where they belonged. You belonged here, Elias said quietly. This was your home. It was, she agreed, but it's not anymore. Home isn't just a place, is it? It's the people who love you, the life you build. This cabin is beautiful, and it holds wonderful memories, but it's not home anymore. They stood together in the empty room, surrounded by the ghosts of her childhood, but somehow not haunted by them. Instead, Matty Joe felt a sense of completion, as if a circle had been closed. "What will you do with it now?" she asked as they prepared to leave. "That depends," Elias said. "What would you like me to do with it?" The question hung between them as they drove back toward Elias's cabin, past the fence they'd repaired together, past the pastures where his cattle grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. Matty Joe thought about ownership and inheritance, about the strange twists of fate that had brought her full circle to the land where she'd been born. "I don't know," she said finally. "It feels too big a decision to make right now." "There's no hurry," Elias said. "The land has waited 15 years. It can wait a little longer." But as they approached his cabin, their cabin, she was beginning to think of it. Matty Joe realized that some decisions didn't need to be rushed into. Some gifts could be received gradually, understood slowly, accepted when the time was right. That evening, as she sat by the fire with Samuel's blanket across her lap and Sarah's music box on the mantelpiece, she thought about the strange mathematics of loss and discovery. She'd lost her parents, her husband, her son, and the home of her childhood. But in losing everything, she'd somehow found herself exactly where she belonged, not in the past, but in the present, not in the place where she'd been born, but in the place where she was learning to live again. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like whispered prayers, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song. Inside, two people who had found each other in their darkest hour sat quietly together, no longer running from their grief, but learning to carry it like seasoned travelers who had finally figured out how to pack light. Sheriff Coleman arrived on a Tuesday morning, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with the kind of news that couldn't wait for a more convenient time. Matty Joe was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of hoofbeats, and something in the urgent rhythm made her stomach clench with dread. "Elias," the sheriff called as he dismounted. "I need to speak with you, and with Miss Keller, if she's here." Elias emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression immediately alert to trouble. "What's wrong, Coleman?" "It's about Tommy Keller," the sheriff said, glancing toward Matty Joe as she approached, her arms full of damp sheets. "His business dealings, specifically. I'm afraid there's been some discoveries that complicate things." Matty Joe felt the blood drain from her face. "What kind of discoveries?" Sheriff Coleman reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a bundle of papers tied with string. "Found these hidden in Tommy's cabin when we cleared it out for the bank. Letters, receipts, records of transactions that paint a pretty ugly picture." He handed the bundle to Elias, who untied the string with careful fingers. As he read, his face grew increasingly dark, the muscles in his jaw tightening with each document he examined. "What is it?" Matty Joe asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. "Your husband was stealing from me," Elias said quietly, his voice carefully controlled. "Cattle mostly, but also cash from some business dealings we had. This goes back almost 2 years." Matty Joe's knees went weak, and she had to grip the porch railing to keep from falling. "That's not possible. Tommy wasn't the couldn't have." "I'm afraid it's all documented," Sheriff Coleman said gently. "Bills of sale for cattle that didn't belong to him, forged signatures on contracts, money that was paid to him for services never rendered. We're talking about theft in the amount of nearly $3,000. $3,000. The sum was so enormous that Matty Jo couldn't even comprehend it. She'd never seen that much money in her entire life, couldn't imagine what Tommy had done with it or why he'd thought he could get away with such a crime. "Where is the money now?" Elias asked. "Gone," the sheriff said. "Gambling debts mostly, from what we can piece together." Tommy had been frequenting the saloon in Millerville, playing poker with men who weren't particular about where their winnings came from. He was in deep to some dangerous people by the time he died. "How deep?" Elias asked. "Deep enough that they would have killed him for it, if the fever hadn't taken him first," Coleman said grimly. "They've been asking questions around town, trying to figure out if he had family who might be good for the debt." Matty Jo sank onto the porch steps, her head spinning with the implications. Not only had her husband been a thief, but he'd left debts that could put her life in danger. Men had been killed for far less than $3,000 in gambling debts. "There's more," Sheriff Coleman said, clearly reluctant to continue. "The men Tommy owed money to, they know he had a wife. They've been asking about her, wondering if she might have access to money or property that could settle his debts." "What are you saying?" Elias asked, though his tone suggested he already understood. "I'm saying that as long as Matty Jo is known to be Tommy's widow, she's not safe. These men don't care that she didn't know about the gambling or the stealing. In their minds, she's responsible for his debts." Matty Jo felt sick to her stomach. Everything Tommy had touched seemed to turn poisonous, even after his death. She'd thought marrying him would give her security, but instead, he'd left her with nothing but shame and danger. "I have to leave," she said quietly, more to herself than to the men. "I can't stay here and put Elias at risk." "You're not going anywhere," Elias said firmly. "These debts aren't your responsibility. But the stolen money, also not your responsibility," he said. "You didn't know about it, didn't benefit from it. The sins of the husband don't automatically transfer to the wife." Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat. "Legally speaking, that's true. But these aren't the kind of men who care much about legal distinctions. They see a debt, they want it paid, and they're not particular about who pays it." "Then we'll pay it," Elias said without hesitation. "Elias, no," Matty Jo said, struggling to her feet. "I won't let you bankrupt yourself to cover my husband's crimes." $3,000 won't bankrupt me," he said, "and it's not about the money anyway. It's about doing what's right. What's right is for me to face the consequences of my own choices." Matty Jo said, her voice stronger now despite the tears that threatened to spill. "I married Tommy. I should have seen what kind of man he was. I should have known." "How?" Elias interrupted. "How could you have known he was stealing from me when I didn't even know it myself? How could you have seen through lies that fooled everyone, including the people he stole from?" Sheriff Coleman watched this exchange with the uncomfortable expression of a man witnessing a private argument. "There might be another solution," he said finally. "The men Tommy owed, they're not from around here. They don't know much about his personal life beyond the fact that he had a wife. If we could convince them that the wife is dead, that there's no one left to collect from, they might give up and move on." "Fake my death?" Matty Jo asked. "Not fake it exactly," Coleman said. "Just let them believe it. Stop using the name Keller, maybe take on a new identity entirely. As far as anyone outside Wilder Creek knows, Matty Jo Keller died with her baby and was buried beside her husband." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Matty Jo tried to imagine erasing herself completely, becoming someone new, leaving behind not just Tommy's debts but also his name, his memory, the entire painful chapter of her life that had led to this moment. "I'd have to disappear completely," she said slowly. "Never use my real name again, never contact anyone who knew me before. People reinvent themselves all the time out here," the sheriff said. "Especially women running from bad situations. It's not uncommon, and it's not illegal, as long as you're not trying to defraud anyone." Elias was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers in his hands, as if they might reveal some solution that hadn't yet occurred to anyone. When he finally looked up, his expression was thoughtful but determined. "There's a third option," he said. What if Matty Jo Keller really did die, but not the way these men think? What do you mean? The sheriff asked. What if she died when she became someone else legally? What if she took a new name through marriage or adoption, became a different person in the eyes of the law? Matty Jo stared at him, understanding dawning slowly. You're talking about adopting me. I'm talking about making you my legal heir, Elias said. Giving you a new name, a new identity, a legitimate reason to be here that has nothing to do with Tommy Keller or his debts. As far as the world is concerned, Matty Jo Grant is a completely different person from Matty Jo Keller. That could work, Sheriff Coleman said slowly. Adoption papers would be public record, easy enough to verify if anyone came asking questions, and it would explain why she's living here without causing gossip about impropriety. But people in town know who I am, Matty Jo protested. They know I was married to Tommy. People in town also know that Elias Grant is a man of his word, the sheriff said. If he says you're his adopted daughter, they'll believe it. And if they don't, they'll keep their mouths shut anyway. Nobody wants to cross the richest man in the county over something that's none of their business. Matty Jo looked between the two men, her mind reeling with the speed at which her life was changing once again. In the space of a single conversation, she'd learned that her husband was a thief, that dangerous men were looking for her, and that her only path to safety lay in erasing herself completely. I need time to think, she said finally. Time is something we don't have much of. Sheriff Coleman said gently, these men won't wait indefinitely for satisfaction. The longer they think Tommy's widow is out there somewhere, the more persistent they'll become. That evening, as Matty Jo sat by the fire with the hidden letter that had revealed Tommy's crimes spread on the table before her, she tried to make sense of how her life had become so complicated. She'd come to Elias's cabin seeking one night of shelter from grief, and now she was facing the complete erasure of her identity to escape the consequences of crimes she'd never known were being committed. But as she watched the flames dance in the fireplace and listened to Sarah's music box playing its gentle lullaby, she realized that maybe erasing Matty Jo Keller wouldn't be such a loss after all. That woman had been broken by circumstances beyond her control, defined by losses that had nearly destroyed her. Perhaps it was time to let her die and see who might be born from the ashes. 3 days after Sheriff Coleman's revelation, Matty Jo walked alone to the small cemetery behind the Methodist church, where Samuel lay buried beside her parents. The morning was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the cottonwood trees that bordered the graveyard had begun to turn gold at their edges. She carried with her the simple wedding ring Tommy had placed on her finger 4 years earlier, a thin band of silver that had never felt like anything more than a chain. Samuel's grave was marked with a small wooden cross that the minister had provided, carved with his name and the dates that bracketed his brief life. Matty Jo knelt beside it, running her fingers over the still fresh earth that covered her son, and tried to find the words for what she needed to say. I have to make some changes, my sweet boy, she whispered. I have to become someone new to keep us both safe. But I want you to know that no matter what name I carry, no matter what papers say about who I am, I'll always be your mama. That will never change. She pulled the wedding ring from her finger and held it up to catch the morning light. Such a small thing to represent 4 years of marriage, 4 years of trying to make the best of a union that had been born of necessity rather than love. Tommy had meant well, in his way, but he'd been broken by war and disappointment, and broken people often broke others without meaning to. Your papa wasn't a bad man, she told Samuel's grave. He was just lost, and lost people sometimes do terrible things trying to find their way. I hope wherever he is now, he's found some peace. She dug a small hole beside the wooden cross and buried the ring there, covering it with earth and fallen leaves until no trace remained. It felt like a funeral for the woman she used to be, a final goodbye to Matty Jo Keller and all the pain that name carried. When she returned to the cabin, she found Elias waiting for her on the porch, an envelope in his hands and a question in his eyes. I've been to see Lawyer Morrison, he said. The adoption papers are ready, if you've decided what you want to do. Matty Jo climbed the porch steps and sat beside him, looking out over the land that had become more home to her in 3 weeks than Tommy's cabin had ever been in 4 years. "I buried my wedding ring at Samuel's grave," she said. "It seemed like the right thing to do before starting over." "And have you decided to start over, I mean?" "I've decided that Mattie Jo Keller has caused enough trouble for everyone," she said with a sad smile. "Maybe it's time to let her rest in peace." Elias handed her the envelope. "Read it first. Make sure you understand what you're agreeing to." The legal language was dense and formal, but the meaning was clear. Elias Grant wished to adopt Mattie Jo Keller as his daughter and heir, granting her all the rights and responsibilities that came with family membership. She would take his name, inherit his property, and become legally entitled to his protection and support. "This says I would inherit everything," she said, looking up at him with surprise. "Your land, your money, all of it." "You're the only family I have left," Elias said simply. "Who else would I leave it to?" "But what if you marry again? What if you have other children?" "I'm 58 years old, Mattie Jo. I'm not looking for romance or more children. What I'm looking for is someone to carry on after I'm gone, someone who will use what I've built for good purposes. I can't think of anyone I'd trust with that responsibility more than you." The weight of what he was offering settled over her like a heavy blanket. Financial security, social respectability, a new identity that would protect her from Tommy's creditors and give her a chance to build a life based on something other than survival. It was more than she'd ever dared to hope for. "There's something else we need to discuss," Elias said. "The town council has called a meeting for tomorrow night. Word has gotten out about the adoption papers, and some folks aren't happy about it." "What kind of unhappy?" "The kind that involves questions about my judgment and speculation about your character. Morrison says they're concerned about the impropriety of the situation, the speed of the decision, the potential for scandal." Mattie Jo felt her heart sink. She'd known this day would come, the day when Wilder Creek's sense of propriety would clash with Elias's unconventional kindness. Small towns had long memories and strict ideas about how things should be done, and a wealthy rancher adopting a young widow with no family connections was exactly the sort of thing that would set tongues wagging. "They want you to rescind the adoption," she said. "It wasn't a question. They want me to consider the implications for my reputation and business interests." Elias said carefully. "Morrison thinks they'll ask me to send you away, maybe provide you with some money to start fresh somewhere else. And if you refuse, then they'll make it clear that my business might not be as welcome in town as it used to be. Banking relationships, cattle sales, supply contracts, all of it could be affected if I'm seen as someone who doesn't respect community standards." Mattie Jo closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of being a burden settling on her shoulders once again. Every time she tried to build something stable, circumstances seemed to conspire to tear it down. She was tired of being the complication in other people's lives, tired of watching good people suffer consequences for showing her kindness. "I should leave," she said quietly. "Tonight, before the meeting. Disappear before I cause you any more trouble." "You're not causing me trouble," Elias said firmly. "Other people's narrow-mindedness is causing trouble. There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I sit, it looks like I'm the common factor in all these problems." Elias was quiet for a moment, staring out at his land with the expression of a man weighing his options. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and determined. "Tomorrow night, I'm going to stand up in front of that town council and tell them exactly why I'm adopting you and why their approval isn't required. I'm going to explain that you're not some charity case or improper arrangement, but family-chosen family, which is sometimes stronger than the blood kind." "Elias, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he said, turning to look at her directly. "I've spent 23 years being careful, being proper, doing what other people expected of me. I've been so busy protecting my reputation that I forgot to protect the things that actually mattered. I'm not making that mistake again." "What if they follow through on their threats? What if you lose business, lose standing in the community?" "Then I'll know who my real friends are," Elias said, "and I'll find other ways to do business. Money can be replaced. Mattie Jo, family can't." That evening, they ate dinner by candlelight while Sarah's music box played its gentle melody from the mantelpiece. The adoption papers lay on the table between them, waiting for signatures that would legally transform them from strangers into family. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of coming rain and the promise of a storm that would test everything they'd built together. "Are you afraid?" Matty Joe asked as they prepared for bed. "Terrified," Elias admitted, "but not of the town council or the business consequences. I'm afraid of losing you. I'm afraid that after tomorrow night, you'll decide this life isn't worth the fight, and you'll leave anyway." "I'm not going anywhere," Matty Joe said with quiet conviction. "We're family now, remember? Family doesn't run when things get difficult. Even if it gets ugly, even if people say terrible things about both of us. Especially then," she said, "because that's when family matters most." They stood together on the porch, looking out at the land that had become their shared home, breathing air that tasted of approaching storms and new possibilities. Tomorrow would bring challenges that would test their resolve and their commitment to each other. But tonight, they were simply two people who had found each other in their darkest hour and decided that some kinds of love were worth fighting for. In the morning, Matty Joe would sign the papers that would make her Matty Joe Grant. Tomorrow night, Elias would face down the disapproval of an entire town to defend their right to be a family. But at this moment, standing together in the Montana darkness with the music box's lullaby drifting through the open door behind them, they were already everything they needed to be two souls who had learned that healing wasn't something you did alone, and that sometimes the family you chose was stronger than anything that blood or law or community pressure could destroy. The storm was coming, but they would weather it together, and when it passed, they would still be standing not as the people they used to be, but as the family they had chosen to become. The town hall was packed with more people than Matty Joe had ever seen in one place, their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and barely concealed judgment. She sat in the front row beside Elias, acutely aware of every whispered conversation and sideways glance directed their way. The bullwhip that had once belonged to Elias's cattle-driving days hung coiled on his belt not as a threat, but as a reminder of the authority he'd earned through decades of honest work and fair dealing. Mayor Hutchins called the meeting to order with more formality than usual, his gavel echoing through the suddenly quiet room like a gunshot. Behind him, the 5 members of the town council sat with expressions ranging from uncomfortable to openly hostile. "We're here tonight," the mayor began, "to discuss a matter of community concern. Mr. Grant, would you like to explain to the assembled citizens why you've chosen to adopt Miss Keller as your daughter and heir?" Elias rose slowly, his hand resting on the coiled whip at his side, a gesture that spoke of confidence rather than aggression. When he turned to face the crowd, his voice carried clearly to every corner of the room. 23 years ago, he said, I lost my daughter to fever, lost my wife in childbirth 6 years before that. For more than 2 decades, I've lived alone on my ranch, telling myself that solitude was safer than risking that kind of pain again. He paused, letting his words settle over the crowd. 3 weeks ago, a young woman knocked on my door in the rain. She'd lost her infant son that very day, had nowhere to go, no family to turn to. She asked for shelter for one night. Matty Joe felt the attention of the entire room focused on her, but Elias's steady presence beside her gave her strength to sit straight and meet their stares without flinching. What I found, Elias continued, was not a charity case or a burden, but someone who understood grief the way I understood it. Someone who needed family as much as I needed to remember what it meant to be part of one. Councilman Bradshaw, the owner of the town's largest general store, stood up from his seat. That's a touching story, Grant, but it doesn't explain why you're rushing into legal adoption. Surely there are other ways to help the girl without making her your heir. There are, Elias agreed. I could give her money and send her on her way. I could find her employment somewhere else, maybe a position as a housekeeper or seamstress. But those solutions assume that helping Matty Joe is about charity, about duty. It's not. It's about family. "Family is blood, Grant," said Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife. "Family is marriage and children born in wedlock. What you're describing is irregular." "What I'm describing," Elias said, his voice growing firmer, "is two people who chose each other when the rest of the world had given up on both of us. Blood doesn't make family, love does. Commitment does. The willingness to stand by someone when times get hard." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some supportive, others skeptical. Mattie Jo recognized the faces of people who had known her parents, people who had watched her grow up and marry Tommy Keller. She wondered what they saw when they looked at her now, the girl they'd known, or the woman who had survived more loss than anyone should have to bear. "The irregularity is exactly the problem," said Councilman Morrison, the lawyer who had drawn up their adoption papers. "People will talk, Grant. They'll assume impropriety even if there isn't any. Your reputation, your business relationships." "My reputation," Elias interrupted, "is built on 30 years of honest dealing and fair treatment of every person in this town. If that isn't strong enough to survive one act of human decency, then it wasn't worth protecting in the first place." He turned to face the crowd directly, his hand still resting on the bullwhip that had once driven cattle across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. "I've employed half the men in this room at one time or another. I've bought supplies from your stores, banked my money at your institutions, paid my taxes, and donated to your churches. In all that time, have I ever given you reason to question my judgment or my character?" The silence that followed was telling. Whatever complaints people might have about Elias Grant's decision, none of them could question his integrity or his contributions to the community. "This isn't about your past behavior," Mayor Hutchins said carefully. "It's about setting precedents, about what happens when other people see wealthy citizens making irregular family arrangements." "What happens," Elias said, "is that other people learn that family doesn't have to look the way it always has, that love and loyalty matter more than convention, that sometimes the best thing you can do for another person is give them a place to belong." Mattie Jo felt tears sting her eyes as she listened to this man, her chosen father, defend their right to be a family with such quiet conviction. She thought about the bullwhip at his side, the symbol of his authority and determination, and realized that some battles were worth fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. Just as Councilman Bradshaw opened his mouth to respond, the town hall door swung open with a bang that made everyone turn. Mattie Jo walked through the doorway, her chin raised and her shoulders set with determination. She'd slipped out during the heated discussion, but now she was back, and she carried herself with a dignity that commanded attention. "If you're going to discuss my character and my place in this community," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, "then I should be allowed to speak for myself." Mayor Hutchins looked uncertain. "Miss Keller, this is highly irregular." "It's Miss Grant now," Mattie Jo said firmly. "The adoption papers were signed this afternoon before witnesses. And if this community has concerns about my fitness to bear that name, then I believe I have the right to address them directly." She walked to the front of the room, past the rows of familiar faces, some sympathetic, some skeptical, all curious about what this young woman who had caused such controversy might have to say for herself. "I know what many of you are thinking," she began, her hands clasped calmly in front of her. "You're wondering what kind of woman shows up at a man's door in the rain and ends up inheriting his fortune 3 weeks later. You're wondering if I'm a schemer, a gold digger, someone who took advantage of a lonely old man's grief." The bluntness of her words caused several people to shift uncomfortably in their seats, but Mattie Jo pressed on. "I can't blame you for wondering. If the situation were reversed, I might wonder the same things. But I can tell you what actually happened, and you can judge for yourselves whether it sounds like scheming or like two broken people finding a way to heal together." She told them about the night Samuel died, about walking 12 miles in the rain with nowhere else to turn. She spoke about Elias's kindness, about the recipe box and the music box and the fence they'd repaired together. She talked about learning to carry grief without being crushed by it, about discovering that family could be chosen as well as born. Mr. Grant didn't adopt me because he felt sorry for me, she said. He adopted me because we became family through shared loss and mutual care, because we discovered that two people who had given up on living could help each other remember how to hope again. She paused, looking directly at the council members who held her future in their hands. As for the inheritance, I didn't ask for it. I would have been content to work as his housekeeper for the rest of my life, but Mr. Grant insisted that family meant sharing everything, responsibilities as well as benefits. Councilman Morrison cleared his throat. That's all very touching, but the legal and social implications remain. What assurance do we have that this isn't simply an elaborate deception? Before Matty Joe could answer, Pastor Williams stood up from his seat in the back of the room. I can speak to that, he said, walking forward with a document in his hands, because I have here the legal papers that formalize a different kind of arrangement entirely. He placed the document on the table before the startled council members. These are adoption papers, yes, but not the kind you've been discussing. These papers establish Matty Joe as Mr. Grant's legal heir and adopted daughter, but they also include provisions that address your concerns about propriety and precedent. Mayor Hutchins picked up the document and read it quickly, his eyebrows rising with surprise. This creates a trust arrangement. Miss Grant inherits the property, but with specific obligations attached. Exactly, Elias said, moving to stand beside Matty Joe. The inheritance comes with the requirement that she use the land and resources to establish a home for orphaned children, a legal, formal institution that will provide shelter and education for children who have nowhere else to go. The room fell silent as people absorbed this unexpected revelation. Matty Joe felt a surge of love and gratitude toward Elias for finding a way to transform their personal arrangement into something that served the broader community. Furthermore, Pastor Williams added, the trust requires that Miss Grant remain unmarried for a period of 5 years, ensuring that the inheritance is used for its intended purpose rather than being transferred to a husband who might have different priorities. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, looked skeptical. And what happens after 5 years? After 5 years, Matty Joe said, I'll be free to marry if I choose, but the orphanage will be established and self-sustaining. The community will have had time to see whether I'm worthy of the trust Mr. Grant has placed in me. Councilman Bradshaw studied the papers with growing interest. An orphanage would be a valuable addition to the community, he admitted. We've had to send parentless children to the state institution in Helena, which is hardly ideal. The trust also provides for employment opportunities, Elias added, teachers, caretakers, farm workers, to help make the operation self-sufficient. It would bring jobs and stability to Wilder Creek. Mayor Hutchins looked around the room, gauging the mood of the assembled townspeople. The hostility that had been palpable earlier was beginning to shift into something that looked almost like approval. This changes the nature of the arrangement considerably, he said finally. What you're proposing isn't just a personal adoption, but a community investment. Exactly, Matty Joe said. Mr. Grant isn't just giving me a fortune, he's trusting me to use it in service of children who need what we both needed, a place to belong, a family to call their own. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, seeing understanding begin to replace suspicion. I know what it feels like to be alone in the world. I know what it means to have nowhere to turn when grief overwhelms you. If I can spare other children that kind of desperation, then this inheritance will have served its highest purpose. The silence that followed was thoughtful rather than hostile. Matty Joe could see people reassessing their assumptions, weighing this new information against their previous concerns. Finally, Dr. Matthews stood up from his seat. I've known Matty Joe since she was a child, he said. I delivered her son, and I was with her when he died. If anyone in this room understands loss and resilience, it's her. If Elias Grant believes she can be trusted with this responsibility, then I believe it too. One by one, other voices joined in support. Mrs. Henderson spoke about Matty Joe's character and work ethic. Mr. Patterson mentioned her parents' good reputation. Even some who had seemed skeptical earlier began to nod their approval of the orphanage plan. When the final vote was taken, the council approved the adoption and trust arrangement by a margin of 4-1. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Matty Joe with offers of help and expressions of support for the orphanage project. Standing beside Elias in the emptying town hall, Matty Joe felt the weight of the marriage certificate in her pocket, not a document of romantic union, but a legal arrangement that had made her Matty Joe Grant and sealed their bond as chosen family. The certificate represented something more precious than romance. It represented the decision of two people to build a life based on love, respect, and shared purpose. Outside, the storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally opened, releasing rain that drummed against the windows like applause. Inside, two people who had found each other in their darkest hour stood together, no longer afraid of what the future might bring. 1 year later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the valley like music carried on the morning breeze. Matty Joe stood on the porch of what had once been her family's cabin, now transformed into the main building of the Wilder Creek Children's Home. Watching 7 orphaned children play in the yard, where she had once helped her father tend vegetables. The cabin had been expanded with 2 additional wing-zone housing, dormitory-style sleeping quarters, the other containing a schoolroom where she taught reading, writing, and arithmetic every weekday morning. Behind the main building, Elias had constructed a barn and workshop where the older children learned practical skills that would serve them well in adulthood. Miss Matty called 8-year-old Emma, the newest arrival at the home. "Look what I found." The little girl came running across the yard, her dark hair flying behind her, clutching something small and precious in her hands. When she reached the porch, she opened her fingers to reveal a bird's nest, perfectly woven from twigs and grass and lined with soft down. "It fell from the apple tree," Emma explained breathlessly. "But look, it's not broken at all. It's still perfect, even though it fell." Matty Joe knelt down to examine the nest, marveling at its intricate construction. "You're right," she said. "Sometimes things can fall and still be whole. Sometimes they just need a new place to rest." Emma beamed at this observation, then carefully placed the nest on the porch railing where it would be safe from the wind. As she ran back to join the other children, Matty Joe reflected on how perfectly the child's discovery captured the essence of what they'd built here. The children who came to them were like that fallen nest, displaced but not destroyed, in need of shelter and care, but still fundamentally whole. There was Thomas, age 12, whose parents had died in a mining accident. Lucy and Sarah, sisters aged 6 and 4, abandoned by relatives who couldn't afford to feed them. Benjamin, 10 years old, whose father had never returned from the war and whose mother had succumbed to consumption the previous winter. Each child arrived carrying their own bundle of grief and fear, but also their own resilience and capacity for joy. Matty Joe had learned that healing children was different from healing adults. Children were more trusting, more willing to accept love when it was offered genuinely, more able to bloom when given the right soil in which to grow. "The morning lessons went well," said Miss Catherine Phillips, the young teacher Elias had hired to help with the growing number of children. She emerged from the schoolroom with an armload of slate boards, her face flushed with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Benjamin is finally reading complete sentences, and the younger ones are making excellent progress with their numbers." "They're fortunate to have you," Matty Joe said, and she meant it. Catherine was only 22, just 4 years older than Matty Joe herself, but she had formal teacher training from the normal school in Helena, and a gift for making even the most reluctant students eager to learn. "I'm the fortunate one," Catherine replied. "I've never worked anywhere that felt more like family than employment." It was true. The children's home operated more like a large family than an institution, with everyone, children, staff and volunteers from town, contributing to the daily work of keeping the place running. The children had chores appropriate to their ages, the older ones helping care for the younger ones, everyone gathering for meals in the expanded kitchen that had once been her mother's domain. Elias emerged from the barn, where he'd been teaching Thomas and two other boys how to properly care for the horses. His hair had gone completely silver over the past year, but his step was lighter than it had been when she'd first knocked on his door. Having children around again had awakened something in him that she hadn't even realized was sleeping. "How many applications came in this week?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her on the porch. "3 more," Matty Joe said. "2 from families in Millerville who can't afford to keep their children, and 1 from the territorial authorities about a boy in Helena whose grandmother just died. Can we accommodate them?" Matty Joe looked out at the children playing in the yard, calculating space and resources with the practical mind she'd developed over the past year. "We'll need to add another room to the dormitory, but yes, we can make it work." This was how they'd grown from the original plan of housing 6 children to their current 7, with more on the way. Every time they thought they'd reached capacity, another child in need would appear, and somehow they would find a way to expand their definition of possible. "Mrs. Anderson stopped by while you were in the barn," Matty Joe said. "She wants to donate fabric for new winter clothes, and her sister is willing to help with the sewing." "The community support has been remarkable," Elias said, and she could hear the wonder in his voice. What had started as a controversial arrangement between 2 grief-stricken people had evolved into something the entire town had embraced. Hardly a week went by without someone offering donations, volunteer labor, or practical assistance. From inside the house came the sound of Sarah's music box, now played every evening at bedtime as part of the children's routine. The lullaby that had once been too painful for Elias to hear had become a source of comfort for 7 little ones who needed reminding that they were safe and loved. "Do you ever miss it?" Matty Joe asked quietly. "The quiet, the solitude." Elias was silent for a moment, watching Emma help one of the younger boys tie his shoe. "I thought I would," he said finally. "I spent so many years believing that silence was safety. But I've learned that silence isn't the same as peace. Peace comes from having people to care about, purposes that matter more than your own comfort." As if summoned by their conversation, Emma came running back to the porch, this time carrying a small wooden cradle that Elias had been crafting in his workshop. "Is this for the new baby?" she asked, running her small hands over the smooth wood with reverence. "It's for any baby who needs it," Elias said, lifting the child onto his lap so she could examine his handiwork more closely. "Sometimes very small children come to us, and they need a safe place to sleep while they grow big enough for regular beds." The cradle was beautiful, made from cherry wood and carved with delicate flowers around the edges. It represented hope and preparation, the faith that there would always be children who needed sanctuary and adults willing to provide it. As the afternoon sun began to slant toward evening, the children gathered for their final lesson of the day, not reading or arithmetic, but the kind of learning that happened when Matty Joe sat with them in a circle and told stories about courage and kindness, about people who had overcome difficulties and found reasons to hope. Tonight, she told them about a young woman who had lost everything but discovered that endings could also be beginnings, that sometimes, when one family ended, a new and bigger family could take its place. She told them about a man who had forgotten how to love until he remembered that love wasn't about avoiding loss, but about embracing the time you had with people who mattered. When the story was finished, and the children had been tucked into their beds with the music box playing its gentle lullaby, Matty Joe and Elias sat together on the porch of the main house, looking out over the empire of love they had built from the ashes of their separate griefs. "We should write to Samuel tonight," Matty Joe said, as she did every week. She had started the practice months, a gal writing letters to her son that she would never send, telling him about the children they were caring for, the lives they were helping to rebuild. It was her way of including him in the family they were creating, of making sure his brief life continued to have meaning. "What will you tell him this week?" Elias asked. "That love multiplies instead of dividing," she said. "That the more people you let into your heart, the bigger your heart becomes, that he's part of every child we save, every family we help create." Above them, the Montana sky blazed with stars, and in the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song. Inside the house, 7 children slept safely in beds that would be theirs for as long as they needed them, dreaming dreams that might actually have the chance to come true. It had been exactly 1 year since Matty Jo Keller had knocked on a stranger's door and asked for shelter for one night. That woman was gone now, replaced by Matty Jo granddaughter, caretaker, teacher, and keeper of lost things that had found their way home. Sometimes the most important journeys, she had learned, were the ones that brought you not to a new place, but to a new understanding of where you had always belonged.